Hey, good morning. This week we are in week 3 of a sermon series that we are calling One Kingdom Indivisible. And One Kingdom Indivisible is a series that is done in coordination and collaboration with dozens of churches around the San Francisco Bay Area. In the first 2 weeks of this series, we have looked at 2 vital truths that God passed on to people, that God passed on to humanity. The first truth is this, that God created me to bless others. That's what he said almost from the very beginning when he spoke to Abraham. He said, I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to all nations. That God's purpose for Abraham and for all of his descendants was not to hoard God's blessings, but to bless others with the blessings that they receive from him. And number 2 is that we cannot live in unity as long as we live with impunity. Here's what I mean. We cannot bless others the way God intended us to bless them if we constantly give ourselves a free pass to harm or neglect rather than bless when togetherness gets hard, because it does, it gets hard. The story of Genesis is a story of brother against brother, generation after generation after generation, all choosing to bless themselves over even their brother. And I think that kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? But here's the thing, we can't really talk about unity if we don't truly understand what unity means, because unity often carries with it some major misconceptions. Namely, there's this misconception that unity means conformity. Conformity says that we must think the same, we must act the same, we must be the same. And there are places in our lives, in our community, in our culture, where conformity can be a good thing. When I played football, or when I played baseball, or frankly, most other team sports for that matter, we all wore a uniform. We wore one set of clothing that was basically indistinguishable from one another. The only thing that set me apart from another member of that team was the number that identified me. I wore a number on my chest and on my back. So we chanted together. We suffered together. We did everything together, and we did it without much of a sense of our own identity. Because community without identity is conformity. And so what many people often hear when we talk about unity is a message of conformity, a message that says, hey, I better adopt the status quo, or I guess they're saying I'm not about unity. And lately, like in our world today, that's exactly what partisan politics has moved in the direction of. Because their message is a message that says, hey, if I'm going to be a Democrat or if I'm going to be a Republican, then I guess I have to adopt the full spectrum of distinctives or policies to conform to that party's platform. And so there's no room for disagreement. There's no room for a variation. A Democrat is X and a Republican is Y. In total, in full. That's the direction that we moved in. But what's ironic is that that's not how things have always been. In fact, our national motto reflects the exact opposite of that. If you reach into your wallet right now and you open it up, or you look in your pocket right now and you pull out some form of currency, a dollar, a coin, whatever it might be, you're going to see a common phrase that is written on that currency in Latin. It's the phrase e pluribus unum. When I was a kid, I think someone told me that was Latin for "in God we trust." It's not. That was wrong. E pluribus unum is a phrase that means out of the many, one. It was an important phrase that reflected the true meaning of unity. You see, then it was 13 distinct colonies, but one nation. Today it's 50 states, but one nation. And throughout our history, it's been a phrase that represents a melting pot of cultures and origin stories ranging from Native Americans to Europeans to Africans and later Asians, all coming together from their respective birthplaces with their unique foods, their unique languages, unique traditions, religions, and so on, all forming a patchwork quilt of one. They come together to form one. E pluribus unum, out of the many, one. E pluribus unum is what unity is truly about, and it has nothing to do with conformity. You know, in May of 2005, 15 years ago, Tiffany and I began to learn the difference between unity and conformity in all the same ways that anybody who's ever been married had to learn about unity. Because 15 years later, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that Tiff and I are completely different. Like in almost every imaginable way, we are very different people. She is insanely organized, and I'm not. She is a night owl. I'm a morning person. She likes mindless TV shows. I like heady documentaries and TED Talks. She likes to listen to music in the car. I like to listen to podcasts. She likes to read fiction. I like to read nonfiction. She likes to vacation in a nice hotel room. I like to vacation in a tent and sleeping bag. She will work first and she will play later. I will play first and work later. As I think about that, sometimes it just feels like the only thing that we share is the reality that we are so different from one another. And yet at the end of the day, when we lay our head down at night and when we rise in the morning, we are not she and I, we are we. And so because like many of you, when we stood before 275 witnesses 15 years ago and we made our vows to one another, our vows were not about conformity, they were about unity. The text says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother, and the two will become one flesh." They'll be united to each other, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And when we both said "I do" that day, both of us were committing not to me, not to our self-interest, but to we. Our oneness, our unity became our new identity. That is who we were. That is what we were about, togetherness. And so that word together in the Greek is a word that means literally with a yoke. A yoke is that thing that ties two oxen or two cattle together. You've seen them before. They're often wood. It ties them together when they work in the field to make sure that they work together, that they move in the same direction. And the beauty of a yoke, or the burden of a yoke, is that one cannot simply choose to separate, right? These two oxen, for better or for worse, are bound together. Even if they don't like each other, even if they don't want to be, they're bound together. Unity is not conformity. Unity is when the many, or the two, become one. And it's important that we understand that as we turn the page into the next phase of this biblical story arc, from Genesis, where we were the last 2 weeks, to Exodus, because just like Tiff and I received a new identity that day 15 years ago, Exodus is a story of God's people receiving their new identity. You know, as last week's message ended, we closed with the story of Joseph. Joseph, if you'll remember, had risen from the ranks, through the ranks, from slave, where his brothers had sold him into in Egypt, to second in command in all of Egypt. And God used his position not only to help Egypt, which he did, but to actually save his own family, Joseph's family, that even though his brothers had wronged him and had meant evil for him, when they sold him into slavery, he said God meant it for good. Guys, the story of Genesis ends on a happy note. Like God's people are alive, they're well, they're doing great in Egypt. But as Exodus begins, 400 years have passed since Genesis ended. And the opening verses of Exodus begin to paint a very different picture of life in Egypt for this family. And I want you to read along with me. Here's how Exodus begins. Exodus 1, verse 8. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies, they'll fight against us, and they'll leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Rameses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them. ruthlessly. And so as Exodus continues, the people begin to cry out to God because of their oppression, because of their mistreatment. For hundreds of years, they cry and they cry and they cry, seemingly with no answer, just silence, no deliverance, no hope, nothing. And yet one day, from inside a burning bush, God begins to speak to a man named Moses, one of them. And the very first thing that God says to Moses is vital. He says, Moses, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Now that may seem like a really strange thing to hone in on and focus on right now, but it's an important foreshadowing for what's to come for God's people. God continued. He spoke to Moses again. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And in the pages to come, that's exactly what God does. With a mighty hand, God miraculously and powerfully moves to rescue his people from slavery. And that's the end of the story, right? Like, God's people suffer and then God rescues. Done deal. Well, no, because God has a lot more in mind for his people. He'd given them a purpose way back in Abraham's day, but now he was going to give them an identity, something that makes them distinct from all other people. And so as Israel came to the base of a mountain and they set up camp, we're told that Moses scaled the mountain to go meet with God, and there God spoke to him. And this is what he said. He said, Moses, this is what I want you to go down and tell everybody. Beginning in verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So what is their identity? It says they are to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. I mean, it sounds neat, right? Kingdom of priests, holy nation. It sounds good. But what does it mean? Well, I want to answer that question. I like how the book Multiply actually describes what it means to be a priest. They describe it this way. They said a priest is someone who represents God to the people and the people to God. They represent God to the people and the people to God. Like, whenever I think about that definition, it kind of makes me think of something like a lawyer in court. You know, a lawyer's job is to represent a plaintiff or a defendant to the judge, and to represent the judge to the plaintiff or the defendant. The lawyer is something of an intermediary between two parties. Well, a priest is kind of like that. A priest represents God to the rest of the people and the people to God. They're an intermediary between God and humanity. And what God is telling Moses here is that though all the nations on the earth are his, they all belong to him, he has a special identity for this group of people, for them, that is unique to them. He says, you guys are going to be a kingdom of priests. In other words, what's God saying? He's telling them that part of their identity will be to represent God to all the other nations on earth, and to represent all the other nations on earth to God. But it's the second facet of their identity that I want to really explore more in depth this morning, because God also said that they would be a holy nation. Now, holy is one of those words I guarantee you've heard before, but it's one of those Christianese, churchy words that we often use when we speak about things like the Holy Spirit or the Holy Bible or, in some traditions, holy water. So what is God talking about when he says that they're going to be a holy nation? What does he mean by that? Well, the most common definition you'll usually hear when someone tries to explain what holy means is this. Holy means set apart. To be holy is to be set apart from everything else. It can be kind of a strange concept to understand, and yet it was so important that when Moses approached the burning bush, do you remember what God said to him? God said, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." God was saying, this ground is different, Moses. This ground is special. This ground is holy. Holy is a word that is used roughly 700 times in our Bible. And the vast majority of them are found right here in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's only used one time in all of Genesis. And so if blessing is the motif of Genesis, I think you can make a strong argument that holiness is the motif for the next four. God is a holy God. And if these people are going to be his treasured possession, they're going to need to learn how to be a holy people, a holy nation. They're going to need to learn what it means to be set apart from the rest of the world. And I bring this up because the apparent tension or the dichotomy between holiness and unity is not lost on me. Because it's like you could say, like, how can you in the same breath tell me that my job is to live in unity and then tell me my job is to be set apart? Like, aren't those two ideas contrary to one another? And my answer is not necessarily, and I'm going to try to explain why. We'll see if I do a good job of it. When I was a kid, one of the activities that we used to do a lot with my mom and my stepdad was we'd go up into the mountains and we would go gold panning. And I had an absolute blast doing that. If you've never been, the process is fairly simple. Like, you get this long metal box, I think it's made from aluminum, it's called a sluice box, and you place it in a creek or a stream of water, and you build this little dam around it with rocks and so on, so that most of the water in the creek has to funnel through this sluice box that you've put there. And inside that box are these like little metal fins, and they're on top of this carpet-like material. And each of those things is designed to catch gold. How? Well, gold is heavy, right? And so the idea is that the gold sinks and it gets caught in the carpet or in the fins, while all the other stuff, all the dirt and rocks, just kind of wash right on through and dump out the other side. And so you take a shovel and you put shovel after shovel after shovel into the sluice box, and you let it wash away until the bottom carpet is so full of debris that you kind of pause and you take it out and you empty that carpet of all the debris into like a gold pan. And if you've ever seen a gold pan, there are these like little ridges, and you take that and you bend over and you put a little bit of water in it, and the ridges kind of make sure that all the heavy stuff falls to the bottom, and you're patiently and slowly working all that stuff that is not gold, that is lighter, out of the pan until hopefully what you have left is heavy, pure gold. Usually what that means is you have a lot of black sand and one or two very tiny microscopic gold flakes. But in its most basic form, gold panning is just a process of refinement. You take a bunch of stuff that's all mixed together, the stuff you want, the stuff you don't want, and you refine it. You separate it. You separate the valuable from the invaluable, and you throw the invaluable away. And what you're left with is the best of the best of the best. Gold. Well, way back in the beginning of time, we already talked about who God created us to be. He created us in his image. And as his image bearers, he looked at Adam and Eve, and what did he conclude? Everything else he said was good, but Adam and Eve, he said, no, these people are very good. In other words, humanity was God's gold standard. But along the way, what we discovered last week through all the stories of brotherly strife and division is that the goodness that God had created in humanity had gotten mixed up with a bunch of stuff that didn't belong there, stuff that was harmful, stuff that was invaluable. And we have a word for that stuff. We call that stuff sin. And if God's people were going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Exodus is telling them they're going to have to learn how to get rid of all that invaluable garbage and sin in their lives and become the pure gold that God had created them to be. You see, the reason that God is holy, the reason that God is set apart from us, is because we are full of sin. And I think this pandemic we're in is actually kind of a great analogy for holiness, because God wants to be with his people, but he can't, because his people have this deadly virus called sin. And so he actually is setting himself apart from them because they're infected. And not only are they infected, but they are willfully choosing to do rebellious and disobedient things day after day after day to keep reinfecting themselves rather than separating themselves from all the sin and rebelliousness in the world around them. And so God has to teach them. He has to teach them what holy living looks like and what it means to be a set-apart people, a holy nation. That's what Exodus is all about. And so in the very next chapter, God gives them 10 commandments for them to live by. He tells them, hey, I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And I want you to, if you have a pen or a highlighter, I want you to mark those 3 words, land of slavery, because they're going to get really important here in just a few minutes. He's saying, hey, you guys, number one, can't just go and worship some other God and still be a holy nation. And you can't just go and worship idols and images and still be a holy nation. He says you can't use my name the wrong way. You have to set aside a day where you rest, just like I did. And he says you can't keep on doing what your ancestors did, just dishonoring your father and mother. You got to honor them. These are all the commandments, right? He says you can't do what Cain did. There's no murdering, guys. We can't be doing that stuff. You can't go and do what Abraham did. No adultery. You can't do what Jacob did. No stealing. And you can't really do what Potiphar's wife did and make up stuff and lie about somebody else. And lastly, you can't look at other people's blessings that I have given them and covet them for yourselves. Like all of those things are done with impunity and they violate unity. All of them. You know, oftentimes we think of the 10 Commandments as a standalone section, but God doesn't exactly stop talking. In fact, for several chapters longer, he keeps talking and he talks to them about how to treat people. How do you treat people who work for you? How do you live justly? How do you treat people with social responsibility? And finally, he's like, this is how you cleanse yourselves and atone from the sin that you do commit when you make those mistakes. God's message for them is important. God's message is powerful. Like, these are all the things that separate me from you. That's what he's telling them. These are all the things that you need to uproot and sift in order to be a holy nation. Sin cannot be allowed to remain. It has to be separated out of your lives. And so his promise to them is there, but his promise to them is conditional. It says, if you obey me fully, if you keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. God's telling them, hey, if you live your lives the way I want you to, rather than the way you've been living them for years, rather than the way all the other people on earth are living their lives, I'm going to give you VIP treatment. I will blow your socks off with more blessings than you can possibly imagine. But there's a flip side to this. And this is why I had you mark land of slavery just a few minutes ago. The flip side is that you don't have to move forward with me as your God. It's your choice. He's saying, like, you could run back to the land of slavery that you knew before. Now, maybe you're kind of listening to this and you're thinking, like, why on earth would anybody choose to run back to a land or a life of slavery? Like, who would choose God's abundant blessings, or who wouldn't choose, rather, God's abundant blessings over slavery? And that's a great question. And yet in John chapter 8, Jesus is teaching, and he says something interesting. He says, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But as you keep reading, we read about some Jews who heard him, and much like we might be inclined to do, they approach Jesus and they say, okay, we're puzzled. We've never been slaves. We're free people, just like us as Americans. We're free people. We've never been slaves. How can you say that we will be set free? And Jesus looks at them in verse 34 and he replies, very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Church, the story of Exodus isn't just a miraculous story of God's rescue and deliverance from unlucky circumstances. The story of Exodus is a metaphor of what it takes and what it means and what it looks like to become a holy nation, to become a set-apart people. It's about a people coming out of kingdom, out of oppression. It's a story that asks you, will you do what it takes to root out the sin in your lives? Or, when it gets tough, will you turn around with impunity and run back to slavery, run back to the sin you once knew, run back to a world where you were only concerned with you? Is that going to be your story? Is that going to be your reality? Because God's people are a people who are called to unite to one another, brother to brother, unite. They are called to treat God with complete reverence, and treat each other as they would want to be treated. Treat each other like they love each other. And the more I read and the more I consider the story of Exodus, the more I'm convinced that Exodus is a response to the rampant, unchecked disease of sin that was coursing throughout the veins of Genesis between brothers and sisters who seemingly had every reason to be united, and yet they weren't. Church, unity is not about conformity. It's not about people all becoming the same. Unity is about the many coming together in pursuit of one goal or one identity. And that is an identity that is no longer rooted in slavery, but in freedom. You know, in 1776, when the guy by the name of Pierre Eugene du Cimetière, I'm probably butchering his name, when he put forth E Pluribus Unum as a national motto, it was about a united goal. Among many distinct people from many distinct colonies, a united goal for freedom. Church, that is the story of Exodus. It's a story of God's people learning to be set apart together. It's about a united effort among all of God's people to link arms and to flee from slavery, to flee from sin, to get out of here together. In Leviticus 19:2, God speaks through Moses, and once again he says to the people, he says, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. What's he saying? He's addressing the whole community here. He's saying, your job is to be set apart together. Be set apart together. Church, in all the same ways that holiness was Israel's identity as a people of God, holiness is also our identity as a people of God. What I mean is in the same way that God rescued Israelites from slavery to Egypt, we all know that God rescued us from slavery to sin when Jesus was hung on a cross for us. Jesus was hung there as an innocent man, not because of something he had done. He was hung on a cross because of what we have done, what you have done, what I have done, what all of us have done. That's why he was there. And so all throughout the Exodus story, God's nation is fighting. They're fighting to turn around, and they're fighting to run back to slavery. They're griping, they're complaining, they want to go back. And many of us read it and we scoff, like, how could they want to do that? That makes no sense. And the irony is that we don't even see the same tendency in ourselves. But here's the truth. We all run to sin nearly every single chance we get. We suffer from the same disease that they did, a disease which seeks to divide and to pit brother against brother and sister against sister. Well, if that's the disease, then Exodus is a story of our journey out of it. It's a one step forward, two steps back kind of journey sometimes, often a two step forward, one step back kind of journey. And it's treacherous and it's bumpy. But Exodus is a reminder to us that there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is freedom, once again, from the sin that enslaves us. But we have to walk on that journey together. We have to be committed to unity and holiness. We have to be set apart together. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter what party you are registered under. We cannot be holy and divided. We can only be set apart together. And for some people, that may feel impossible. But Jesus went to the cross to show that impossible things are possible. He went to the cross and he showed that dead people like you and me can actually live. And so if Jesus can raise the dead, then you better believe that even the most different among us can be set apart together. Like a yoke between two oxen, where separation isn't an option, and when two become one, then we are finally ready to live out God's vision for the church as one body comprised of many parts. Church, that is my prayer for you. That is my prayer for me this morning. That is my prayer for Christians across our land. May we, the church, be set apart together. May we pursue holiness together. That's my prayer for us. If you would like to receive Jesus into your life this week, you can be baptized into him. You can receive him, and you can join us on that journey to be set apart together. I want to invite you to do that. If you'd email us at questions@lakemercedchurch.com, we would love to follow up with you and give you more information about what that journey looks like. We're all on a journey. Exodus is about a journey. Our life is about a journey. Let us do it together. Let us be set apart together. We'll see you next time. God bless you, friends.